My name is Erica Kleitz. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm an extension educator with Michigan Sea Grant. And we're really glad you've joined us tonight for Harmful Algal Blooms 101. So I did want to remind everyone that Michigan State University is an affirmative action equal opportunity employer, and our programs are open to everyone. I also want to acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, and we're offering this land acknowledgement to affirm Indigenous sovereignty and working as a measure of our commitment to holding Michigan State University accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. All right, we're going to get started with an introduction video from our Sea Grant directors.
Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Dr. Sylvia Newell, Director of Michigan Sea Grant and a research scientist studying nitrogen cycling and harmful algal blooms. We're so glad you're here to learn about harmful algal blooms, which are beginning to affect more and more people around Michigan each year. In my research, I focus on how nutrients drive harmful algal blooms and how nitrogen particularly can make those blooms more toxic. We hope you'll take what you learned today and share it with your neighbors and to help us all keep Michigan's Great Lakes and inland waters as clean and healthy as we can.
So I hope you enjoyed that brief introduction from our Sea Grant director. So to start out, just wanted to remind you of the talks that we have for you tonight. So I'll be your first speaker for Harmful Algal Blooms 101, and then we've got 3 great speakers after me. So we hope you can stay for the entire evening and hear about a lot of different aspects of harmful algal blooms in Michigan. So we're going to start with a quiz about what HABs are, what they look like. So we'll see what you know or already, or just go ahead and guess about HABs. So in this photo, is this a harmful algal bloom? And you can just put in chat yes or no, whatever you think. All right, looks like we've got mostly no. So that is correct. This is not a harmful algal bloom. Does anyone know what this is? All right, some different guesses. Yeah, so this is filamentous algae. So you'll hear a little bit more about algae later in the talk today. So, but that's what is in this photo. So it has a lot more structure than cyanobacteria does. Okay, here's another one for you. So, is this a harmful algal bloom? What do you think? Yes or no? All right, I see a little bit of disagreement, some no's, some yeses. So this is also not a harmful algal bloom. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, some people got it. Yep, this is pollen. So it's a little bit hard to tell in this photo, but it's a bit yellowier than HABs often are. And so when there's a lot of pollen coming out from trees and then falling onto the lake, this is actually Lake Michigan in this photo, it can get concentrated together and look quite similar to a harmful algal bloom. So yeah, good guess. All right, how about this one? Is this a HAB? All right, yeah, I see a lot of yes answers. Yes, that's correct. So here's a little photo with a little bit more of a blown up image. So yeah, you can see that it looks more like spilled paint. It's very green throughout the water. In this photo, you can actually see in the back, here's some plants floating on top of the water. But what we're looking at here is just in the water itself. All right, here's another one. Is this a HAB? All right, I see a lot of no's. You're correct. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, I see some correct answers. So yeah, these are some aquatic plants, like watermeal, duckweed. So sometimes from far away, if you look at a bunch of these on the water, it can look really similar to a HAB. But if you look up close, that's why I wanted to show you this other image in a bucket with a less dense example, you can see the individual outline of these plants. So even though they're small, they're distinct in that way, in a way that harmful algal blooms are not. All right, one last one for you. Is this a HAB? All right, I see a lot of yes answers, and you are correct. Yes, this is the western basin of Lake Erie, an area that often has HABs every year. And you can see in this photo the way that the green is kind of throughout the water. You can see it even in the wave crashing on the shore. So that's more the image that we're looking for. So hopefully this was helpful for you in kind of getting your mind tuned into what we're looking out for about HABs. So I just wanted to go over a couple of main points about HABs. So what a HAB is, it's an area of algae that grows rapidly in an area. It's visible without a microscope. So often we'll see some really pretty photos later of algae with a microscope. So this is an area of a bloom where we can see it without a microscope. It's only harmful if the algae are capable of producing toxins. So if the algae can't produce toxins, it's not a HAB. And typically people say it looks like spilled paint, pea soup, floating scums, mats, sheens, clumps, or streaks. So that's more the image that we're looking for. For HABs in Michigan, all HABs in Michigan are from cyanobacteria, also called blue-green algae because Michigan is freshwater. So I know we have potentially people joining us today from other states and even countries. And so if that's the case, it may not be true for your area. But in Michigan, the Great Lakes, inland lakes, rivers, and streams, that's all freshwater. So the HABs that we get are associated with cyanobacteria. And there's multiple species of cyanobacteria that can produce toxins. So I wanted to show you some other photos here. So on the left, you've seen this photo already. Then the next one, it's kind of more diffuse, just sort of towards the edge. A bloom. This bloom is more blue-green in color. And then this one, the HAB here it's not these plants floating on the surface, but this kind of green-yellow color underneath. So you can see that it is relatively variable in terms of what a HAB looks like. All right, so the next thing we're going to go through is some myths that you may or may not have in your mind about HABs and kind of do a little bit of myth busting. So our first one is that all algae is harmful. So you might think if I have algae in my pond or my lake or the Great Lakes, it must be a bad thing. So the reality is that algae can be and often is good. So algae as phytoplankton form the foundation of most aquatic ecosystems. Algae are simple photosynthetic organisms that are found in a wide range of environments and has been on Earth for actually millions to billion of years, so a long, long time. So you can see in this graphic here, we're showing the base of the food chain, which is made up of algae and other things, and then we go all the way up to fish and eventually humans. So algae are often a very important part of our marine freshwater environments. So another myth that you might have is that all algae contain toxins. And the reality here is that most algae do not produce toxins. So most types of algae, like green algae, filamentous algae that we saw a picture of earlier, they don't produce toxins. So they're not capable of becoming a harmful algal bloom. It's the cyanobacteria that can produce toxins. Another myth you might have about HABs is that all HABs are green in color. And the reality is HABs are often green, so the most common colors are bright green or blue-green, but they can be blue, red, pink, purple, milky white, so there can be some variation. You can see in these photos, on this first one, there's kind of a red-brown color. This one is a mix of green and red. And over on the right, this one is like a bright blue color. So you don't want to, it's not always, they're not always green, but it is certainly one of the more common colors, but they can be other colors as well. So another myth is that you can tell whether toxins are present by the appearance of the bloom. So the reality is that to know whether toxins are present, you need to do chemical testing. So testing by a lab is the only way to know what toxins are present and what their concentration is. This isn't something we can know just by looking at the bloom. It doesn't matter if you're a scientist that works in that area or not. You need to do testing to know what's there. So because testing often involves some kind of delay, because we usually have to take samples off-site, Things that you want to look for is just this appearance of the HAB, and then be aware that the highest toxin levels are generally going to be found in scums or mats. So especially if you're seeing that, typically those are going to be the highest toxin levels. And also generally, if you have clear water that's next to a HAB, that's generally not going to be harmful to people. So those are just some general rules of thumb, but otherwise we have to send samples out for testing to know for sure. Okay, another myth you might have is that HABs don't change over time. You might think if it's on the beach by my house today, that means it'll be here tomorrow or next week. And that's really not the case. So because HABs are living, they're collections of living organisms, they do change over time. The look and size of the bloom can change. It can appear and disappear quickly. And HABs also move with winds and currents. So especially in an inland lake, for example, you could have a HAB on one side of the lake that over time moves to another side of the lake, and it could even go back and forth. So though we like knowing, something like, well, it's bad today, but will it be better to swim tomorrow? That's really hard to predict with HABs because they do change a lot over time, and they do move and appear and disappear from different places. Okay, I wanted to touch on a couple of less common situations about HABs. So I'm going to talk in a little bit about the general things that contribute to HABs occurring, which is usually warm water and high levels of nutrients. But it's also true that HABs can occur in cold water. They can occur in nutrient poor areas like Lake Superior. And they can occur in rivers and streams, not just lakes. So I just want to mention these just so if you see something somewhere else and you wonder, could this be a HAB, but it's cold water or it's not a heavy nutrient area, it still could be a HAB. So cyanobacteria are very ancient organisms, as I mentioned, and so they've adapted over time to many different types of environments, which is why we can see so much variability in where they occur. All right, so within Michigan itself, where do we see HABs occurring? So on this map, every county that's green is one that has had reported blooms from 2017 to 2022. So you can see that it covers most counties of the state. HABs are generally more common in the Southern Peninsula. They're more common in shallow lakes and lakes with an impoundment. So like a man-made lake that has a dam or something like that. In the Great Lakes, because that first map I just showed you was for inland lakes, this is for the Great Lakes, we see HABs in certain areas recurring over time. And this includes western basin of Lake Erie, Lake St. Clair, the Saginaw Bay, as well as locations in Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, and Ontario. So while we're talking about the Great Lakes Basin, I wanted to remind everyone that wherever you are, if you're in Michigan, you are part of the Great Lakes watershed. So every drop of water that falls in Michigan eventually ends up in one of the Great Lakes. And that's what you can see depicted on this map. So on this map, this gray color here, all of the water that falls in that area is flowing into Lake Huron. In the green color, all that water is flowing into Lake Michigan. In the yellow, it's flowing into Lake Erie. So you can see how large these areas are. And this just kind of brings home the point that whatever we do in Michigan really matters because all of the water and ecosystems, everything that's happening on the land is also going to impact our Great Lakes. All right, finally wanted to show a little bit of data on reports of HABs over time. So you can see that the number of reports, potential reports, has been increasing, and the number of bodies of water with confirmed blooms has been increasing. However, we don't know that this means that there are more HABs occurring. It could also just be that as people become more familiar with HABs, they're more likely to report them, and so we're receiving more reports of HABs. So this is something that we don't really know about, but this is also an area you can help with. Because part of what we would need to answer this is just more data on what people are seeing. So this is one of the reasons we want people to be sure to report when they're seeing things, so we can be sure that the data is getting more and more accurate over time. So I mentioned that some of the main causes of HABs are warm, calm water, high levels of nutrients, and nutrients can come from a variety of sources. You'll be hearing some more about this later on, but those sources could include fertilizer runoff, animal waste, septic systems, stormwater runoff, and there's other events that impact the occurrence of HABs as well. So there's many different reasons why HABs are a problem. Among those are risks to human and animal health, nuisance, odor, and visual effects. So this can really impact tourism and recreational activities negatively, as well as decreasing water quality and ecosystem health, and potentially even drinking water. So if you have a HABs occurring near a drinking water intake, there are ways that you can treat that, but it's going to require some more expense to do that. So the main point here is if you do see something that you think is a HAB, make sure to report it. So you can email any photos and the location to algaebloom@michigan.gov. The photos are really important because as you saw from some of the photos I showed you earlier, we can't always tell if it's a HAB from a photo, but we can make a pretty good guess, and we can often rule out some things that it may not be. So it's really important to send in those photos. And then there may be testing conducted afterwards, and local health departments may issue advisories depending on the results of that testing. Finally, if you want to view current live HABs reports for Michigan, there's a map that you can do this through EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And so this is a screenshot of the reports from 2023. You just want to keep in mind that this data is never going to be 100% complete. And so keep in mind those visual reminders of HABs that might tell you that a HAB is in the area, because that's always going to be more real time than these reports are. All right, finally, I'd just like to acknowledge the whole group that worked together to bring you this webinar, and everyone who contributed photos to it and content, and pause for any questions.
Thanks, Erica. This is Geneva Langland again. You've got a lot of awesome questions in the Q&A, and I think some of them might be addressed in upcoming presentations, but a couple that we might circle back to now. Can there be an odor associated with a HAB, or what sort of smells might someone notice?
That's a good question, and I actually don't know about that. I think that there can be an odor because I know that can impact recreation and even drinking water, but I don't know what it smells like. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that.
I believe a lot of times if it's bad enough, you can smell dimethyl sulfide is one of the primary outgassing components, and it has to be a pretty severe and really dense and decaying area of the blooms to smell it, but you definitely can, and it's got kind of a sulfidey smell. If it's bad enough and you get close enough, you can actually feel a little twinge in your nose. But that's the primary I know of.
Thank you.
Let's see, a couple other questions to get to now. So just confirming, do we ever get red colored blooms in Michigan, or is that just a saltwater effect in places like Florida?
Yeah, so those photos, all the photos I showed were from Michigan. So yes, those red blooms can occur in Michigan. It's not the same as red tide. Red tide is involves a different organism than we have here, but we can get blooms red in color.
All right, we have one person wondering, can Cladophora ever become a harmful algal bloom, or is it a different sort of problematic algae that really contributes more to problems when it dies and decays and bacteria breed in it?
So my understanding is that it would not be considered a HAB because it doesn't produce toxins. But like you said, Geneva, that it can cause a nuisance in other ways. So I don't know if Julianne or Eric want to weigh in on that, but that's my understanding.
From a health perspective, it can sequester E. coli in it, or sometimes botulism.
But would it still be considered a HAB then, or would it just
But
be
it
considered?
still would not be considered a HAB.
Okay, thank you.
So it can be a nuisance, but not technically a harmful algal bloom. Is it possible to form an educated guess about an algal bloom's toxicity based on microscope observation, or does that really require specific lab tests?
I don't know the answer to that one, so if anyone else wants to weigh in.
It really requires specific lab tests. There's the strain of the cyanobacteria needs to have the genes to produce the toxin, and then whether or not they're actually expressing those genes might be even different over time and in different conditions.
Great, thank you, Alex. We should probably go on, I'm thinking, Geneva. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Julianne Heinlein. Hopefully I said that correctly.
Yep.
All right, Julianne is a researcher in algal taxonomy at the Great Lakes Environmental Center. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Sure, no problem. I get to introduce some of the fun stuff about algae and show you lots of nice photos. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Erica touched on a few of the important things in her talk, but we'll see what we can get through here. First of all, what is algae? Most people don't actually understand that, and there's not a general consensus, but what it is considered an unnatural grouping of organisms. And what that means biologically is that they are not related, closely related evolutionarily. So some of the types of algae are more closely related to us as humans than they are to other types of algae. But ecologically and functionally, they have similarities in the ecosystem. And it's just a huge array of different types of organisms. And while I finish talking about some of the commonalities, which I have outlined on this slide, I'm going to start a little slideshow of a bunch of beautiful pictures of algae while I'm talking about those. So even though they're not related evolutionarily, the primary thing that combines all groups of these organisms into algae is that they are capable, or at least were at some point in history, of photosynthesizing. So they all have something called chlorophyll A, which is the primary photosynthetic pigment. And photosynthesis, if you need a quick reminder, it's when algae and plants, so any photosynthesizers, they can use energy from the sun and use that energy to combine water and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and make sugars out of it. So they use the energy from the sun to make food. So they're primary producers. They're the base of our food chains in our food webs. And all algae can photosynthesize. They all have chlorophyll A. They're mostly aquatic, although not all aquatic. And they're relatively simple body structure. So they're not plants, but because they don't have a lot of differentiation and a lot of specialized areas, but I'll get into a little bit of that later. So hopefully those pictures, I know they went kind of quickly, but there's a lot of them, give you some idea of the wide range of algal types. And I wanted to bring up a couple of evolutionary milestones and just kind of wow factors with algae. As Erica mentioned, algae are billions of years old. Blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria, or cyanophytes are also called, are about 3.5 billion years old. There's some of the first organisms that were created. And they were the first photosynthesizers, which means they're the first organisms that were producing oxygen. As a result of photosynthesis, you get water and carbon dioxide combining, and then you release oxygen. And before the cyanobacteria, there was very little oxygen in our atmosphere. And after they developed and they started growing, and over the course of millions of years, they allowed oxygen to develop into the atmosphere to a level that allowed our predecessors to evolve. So you can thank blue-green algae for basically all life that's dependent on oxygen production in our atmosphere. And these down here in the corner here, these are stromatolites. Those are some of the remnants of these ancient cyanobacteria cultures. You can find them in different parts of the world. Green algae, which is another of the large groupings, are dated to about 900 million years ago. And other than just being ancient, they also gave rise to the land plants directly. We'll look at some of the algae. There's algae in Michigan that are in the group or the phylum that is most closely related, and that's on that direct evolutionary lineages to land plants. And then diatoms, which is another big grouping. These are algae that have, believe it or not, they have glass cell walls, they have silica cell walls, they're finely ornamented, they're very ornate, and they've been around. They're some of the younger, the babies of the algae groups. But they also, in that time period, they developed more species than all other photosynthetic groups except for the flowering plants. And they have become one of the most important groups of organisms for life on Earth today. Just a little bit more about the diversity of algae. The size range is many orders of magnitude, from these small little single-celled bacteria here, cyanobacteria, that are only 3 micrometers long, and the micrometer is 1,000th of a millimeter. So these guys, and the same types that created the oxygen in our atmosphere, are 1,000th of a millimeter long or big. And then they can grow up to these giant kelp. Giant kelp are algae. They still are considered part of the algal group because they're not true plants. If anybody is interested later, I can tell you how we kind of differentiate that. But so from these microscopic single-celled organisms to giant kelp, that's the size range of these things. And they can be these single cells to these giant plant-like structures to this pediastrum here, which is a common alga, and that's just a colony of cells. So each one of these cells can live on its own, but it lives in this complex looking little colony of cells. And then this is Spirogyra, which is another common Michigan alga, and it's a filament, and they're filaments of connected cells. So it's many cells, each connected to make these filaments. Ecologically, they're everywhere. As Erica mentioned, because they're ancient, they've developed to live in any number of environments. They're in the Arctic. They are in hot pools in Yosemite National Park. They're mostly aquatic, so you're going to find them in every lake, stream, in the oceans, in wetlands, and even in your bird feeders. This is Hematococcus. It will show up in your bird feeder or other small pools of water occasionally. But they grow on desert soils. They grow in your yard. This up here is nostoc and Nostoc commune, and it is one of the common ones in Michigan. You might find it in a yard. A lot of people think it's fungus, but it's not. It's actually a filamentous alga that grows in these weird colonies. And then lichens, algae are a part of lichens. They're a part of the symbiosis. If we didn't have algae and fungus, we wouldn't have lichens. And then even situations where this is a bromeliad or a kind of a rainforest plant, and they tend to collect water in the center of them. And what we find in tops of trees where these bromeliads grow, on trees, little tiny ecosystems with algae as the primary producers develop inside of these bromeliads, and frogs will lay their eggs in there and grow and develop into tadpoles. And that's all, they're using that algae as the primary source. Oh, and up here, this is snow algae. Most people have no idea about that, but there is primarily one type of algae, but there are some others that form this kind of red, they call it watermelon snow. And they live mostly in areas where the snowpack is around all year round. Ecological importance, we touched on them being photosynthesizers, and I have, and Erica mentioned it, they are the base of the food web in almost all aquatic ecosystems. They feed the oceans, lakes, rivers, and even some terrestrial ecosystems like I just mentioned to you. They are phytoplankton is algae that is in the water column. And that is the primary food source for things like zooplankton and benthos and other microcrustaceans that then feed the fish that people like to catch. They are oxygen producers. I explained how cyanobacteria created the oxygen in the ocean atmosphere, but did you know that you can credit marine diatoms, that group of algae that has these glass cell walls, for about 20 to 40% of the oxygen in each breath that you take. So estimates vary a lot because it's hard to determine, but scientists think that marine diatoms or diatoms in the ocean produce 20 to 40% of what is currently in Earth's atmosphere, the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. So as much as rainforests and other plants. In your lakes and streams, they're habitat, other than being food, they're also habitat for other organisms. So they have, they form structures that then microorganisms can live on, and those microorganisms are great food for larval fish and up the food chain. They're also nutrient cyclers and sinks. So they remove nutrients out of the water by growing. And that way, in that way, they can be used in some circumstances to remove nutrients from a water column.
Hey, Julianne, this is Erica. So this is about your 3-minute warning. Sorry, I
Oh my
missed the
God.
5-minute
Okay.
mark.
All right. Okay. Let me touch on so an important thing is that they sequester carbon because of this. So they take in these nutrients, they grow, they capture carbon, and then in the oceans, they sink to the deep ocean bottoms, and they can sequester carbon for hundreds and thousands of years by taking it out of the atmosphere and out of the water. Let's go. Let me just show you some of the things that you might see. These are some of the groups that you'll find with the naked eye out in your places. So there's benthic green algae. This is Cladophora. Erica talked about a little bit. It's a normal. It only grows to nuisance levels if there's a nutrient runoff. This is Spirogyra and some other things. That's what we call frog spit or pond scum, which is another common organism in lakes and in shallow areas. These guys are the diatoms. They are one of the most important food sources for fisheries going up the line, and outside of being the oxygen producers, and they form these kind of films on rocks and the phytoplankton as well. These are some other cyanobacteria that you might see. They're benthic, meaning they're on the bottom. Most of the halves are filamentous or planktonic. These are some of the halves that you'll see, not all of them. These guys in the left-hand corner are a common seasonal bloom that happens. They're it's called Gliotrichia. They're non-harmful and they're kind of cool. It always reminds me of like a star-filled sky when they bloom. And I guess, and I'll leave with Kara here because this is one of the things that you're going to find in most of the inland lakes around Michigan, or many of them. Most people think they're plants. They're not plants. They're actually Kara or muskgrass or skunkweed is actually algae. And these are some things that are not algae. But I'll stop there. Sorry for taking up too much time there. It's too much to talk about with algae.
You're all good, no worries. Yes, great, thank you. So I'm gonna let Geneva ask any Q&A from the group.
Thank you, Julianne. That was very cool. And I can see why algae are our friends. There are so many different ways that they can exist in the world. One of our guests is wondering, when people talk about algae and how much there is, what are the metrics that they usually use to refer, like what's the metric for them?
That really depends on what scale you're looking at. We tend to look at, often chlorophyll A amounts are used to determine the amount of phytoplankton or the amount of, Chlodophora, as it's kind of a surrogate for biomass. So you'll look in per milliliter how much chlorophyll is in an area. We also look at what we call biovolume. So what we'll do is calculate the volume of cell space that is in samples that we get, and then so that would be in micrometers cubed, but then we extrapolate that up to how much would be in what we'd see per milliliter. But in the past, and some people still do something called ash-free dry mass, where what they will do is collect either phytoplankton or benthic algae, and then they'll dry it all down. They'll weigh it before it's dry, they'll dry it, they'll weigh it, then they'll burn it and ash it all up, and then measure and then weigh what's left. So they get an idea of how much organic matter is there, and that would be in milligrams or grams. So it's probably a more complicated answer than you were hoping, but it's really relevant to what your question is. Hopefully that gives you some idea.
Yeah, thank you. The question asker was wondering if like cells per milliliter is a metric that one might see, or are cells too, small to actually count?
No, in fact, I count cells, count ID cells, and that's a common way. So yeah, cells per milliliter, biovolume per milliliter, even something called natural units. So that means, a number of colonies per milliliter. But yes, that's a common outcome from a phytoplankton or a periphyton count and ID.
Right. We've got some helpful resources getting dropped in the chat, so be sure to take a look at those, and we'll be adding them to the resources document that we sent out before the webinar, and we'll send out again afterward. Another question, can algae ingest nanoplastics, thereby bioaccumulating plastic up through the food web?
There are only a few algae that are heterotrophic, meaning they eat other things, so they'll ingest other things. And that is certainly possible with those organisms. But another way for nanoplastics to influence algae is simply from the chemicals leaching out of those nanoplastics into the surrounding, the microclimate around the algae and being incorporated into algal cells that way. I don't know what the research says as far as how significant that is, but it's certainly a potential. But as far as ingesting it, it's mostly zooplankton and others that are ingesting the microplastics. But it's a good question.
All right, well, we'll do a couple more questions out of the Q&A box, and then we can always run back to them at the end of the presentations. Since starry stonewort has become a problem in many Michigan lakes, where does this invasive fit into the algae community?
It is more closely related to Chara. It's, well, no, I'm not, I don't even want to say that. Functionally, it's like Chara or the musk grasses. It could potentially feed organisms, like ducks and other waterfowl, but there aren't a lot of waterfowl that eat it. The problem with it is it grows to in such huge amounts that it can shadow out other more productive or more important algal communities for the ecosystem or other plants. So it fits functionally kind of like Cara would, because it is a macroscopic plant type structure, but it doesn't tend to have a lot of functional uses that we know of in the community, at least at this point.
Right, great. Well, thank you so much, Julianne. That was awesome. And I think there's a couple more questions in the chat if you want to take a look and see about those. So our next talk, I know many of you are curious about public health as it relates to people and pets with HABs, and that's the talk we're going to hear next. So I'd like to welcome Alex. All right, Alex Rafalski, toxicologist with Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks for the organizers of this, and thanks everyone for attending. Looking forward to this discussion. And like Erica mentioned, my name is Alex Rafalski. I'm a toxicologist with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and I help coordinate public health responses to HABs across the state. And so why are HABs a health concern? And that's because they can contain cyanotoxins. And so as we've been discussing, cyanobacterial blooms are considered harmful because many of them have the potential to produce toxins. And so there are a number of toxins that they may contain, and we can group those into what health effects they are associated with. And so there's hepatotoxins or liver toxins called microcystins, nodularins, and cylindrospermopsin. There are neurotoxins, so that affects the nervous system. Some are called anatoxin A and saxitoxins. There are dermatoxins or skin toxins. And we're learning more about really all the compounds that these cyanobacteria can contain. And so there's some things like lipopolysaccharides in the cell walls that we think might be irritants. So that might be responsible for causing like skin irritation or gastrointestinal irritation. And different species of cyanobacteria can produce one of these, or they may produce a couple of them. And I have an asterisk here next to microcystins, nodularins, cylindrospermopsin, and anatoxin A. And these are the ones that our state of Michigan agencies measure in the harmful algal blooms that we respond to. And so the health effects that people and animals might experience depends on a number of factors. And so one of those being, how are you being exposed to the cyanobacteria and the toxins they might contain? And so primarily that's usually through recreation. So that's, swimming in the water or jet skiing in the water, wading in the water, maybe fishing. And there is a potential for cyanobacteria to be in water bodies that are used as drinking water sources. I think someone mentioned that in 2014, microcystin in HABs in Lake Erie affected the Toledo public water supply. I will say that since approximately 2019, public water supplies in Michigan have been voluntarily sampling their drinking water for cyanotoxins, and that we found no issues to date. And so as far as the health effects that people might experience from recreation, that's going to depend on like the duration and frequency of that exposure. Are you wading into the water, or are you swimming and ingesting the water? Or are you wading in and you're just having skin contact? the amount of toxin that's present, the type of toxin that's present. So in the testing that we've done throughout the state since 2017, microcystin is by far the most common toxin that we've found. And anatoxin A and cylindrospermopsin we find much less frequently. And then some other individual risk factors can affect the health effects that you may experience. So younger people and older people tend to be more sensitive to health effects. Certain underlying medical conditions may influence the health effects you experience. So these liver toxins, if you have liver disease, they may be more harmful. Also, certain skin conditions might make you more likely to get a rash from your exposure. And then here's a list of some of the symptoms you might experience if you come in contact with a HAB or the toxins. So skin irritation, respiratory irritation, gastrointestinal illness, neurological symptoms, and potentially harm to the liver and kidneys. And it's really the exposure route that's going to affect the symptoms. And so ingestion of the cyanobacteria and the toxins, that's what's going to be, potentially harming the liver, or that's where you're going to experience the gastrointestinal effects. If you have direct skin contact, that's what's going to cause the rashes. Inhalation of aerosolized droplets, so jet skiing or boating through a bloom could bring up those toxins into the air and you could be inhaling them. Kind of already touched on drinking contaminated water, but obviously that would be a potential for ingestion of toxins. And these pictures here show, what not to do. You can see people in what is, obviously a cyanobacteria bloom. You guys are all experts on identifying those, very impressed. And this is exactly what we would recommend avoiding. And that, and then I put this slide in here. So there's a lot of health effects discussed on here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but this is to show that exposure can potentially affect a number of organ systems and things throughout your body in both animals, humans and animals. And there's a lot of symptoms on here that people might experience with other potential like waterborne diseases, or they're just not very specific to HAB exposure. And there are no medical tests right now that are specific to like the cyanotoxins. And so, if you do get sick because you suspect of a HAB, that's really important to mention to your doctor or your veterinarian. Mention to them that you're suspicious of your contact with a potential HAB. And so Michigan has a One Health approach to responding to harmful algal blooms. And this graphic shows the different state agencies and local health departments and their role in that response. And we have a interagency work group of representatives from these agencies, and our goals with harmful algal blooms, including monitoring the geographic extent and occurrence of these blooms, conducting surveillance for human and animal illnesses, educating the public, communicating and coordinating on public health advisories when needed, and then addressing and identifying emerging concerns related to harmful algal blooms. And so we do these efforts with a bunch of partners. You know, we have Sea Grant and others on the call today, work with local health departments, local lake associations often, universities, federal agencies, etc. And so it's been mentioned a couple times today that we do encourage people to report suspicious looking algae blooms to EGLE, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And so you can do that by emailing them at algaebloom@michigan.gov. And much of what I think we know about the occurrence of HABs across the state comes from reports from mostly citizens, something that they've observed on their lake. And so really encourage reporting if you see a suspicious looking algae bloom. And EGLE assesses those reports for any that look like potential HABs, cyanobacterial blooms. They can determine if a site visit is necessary or feasible, and then toxin testing can occur if appropriate. And they share this information with MDHHS and other agencies. And so as far as, next steps for public health actions, we're going to perform some risk assessment of the, facts of the bloom. And so, quantitative toxin analysis is a measure of potential cyanotoxin exposure, but it's really not the only factor we consider when evaluating the risk of these blooms. Like others have mentioned, it can take a long time to get the results of toxin tests. And also these blooms can be very dynamic, and so they can, disappear. They might change location, and then they're living organisms, and the blooms can grow and reduce, and the toxin concentrations are going to grow and reduce with them. So a single snapshot in time of a toxin concentration isn't usually the only thing that we consider when doing our public health risk assessment. And so, what do we consider? It's the proximity of the bloom to recreational areas, the extent around the lake, the duration of the bloom. Yes, we look at toxin concentrations, any history of toxin detection on the lake. So we can't say for certain that year to year that, if a HAB produced toxins in the past, that it's going to produce toxins the next year, but certainly we have a lot of examples where that's the case. And, we might consider any reported illnesses and then the water body uses. And so
This is your 1 minute warning. So,
oh, 1 minute. Wow. Okay. So we're going to consider these factors, and public health actions range from no action to like awareness or health education, communication, up to maybe advisories and closures. And so to give some examples of what this might look like. So, sometimes these blooms are very, just like this picture, just like sparse and like just very small. This is like a 1 square foot area. Maybe at the end of the season, so in an isolated canal. So it's like maybe not going to be doing anything with this report. Up to, there's blooms along lakefront properties, and we want to get health education materials out there, up to maybe a bloom's occurring at a beach and it should be closed while the bloom is present, up to, assessing for any drinking water concerns. And so kind of touched on this. The key point is that the data suggests that avoiding cyanobacteria minimizes most exposures. And so what we've done over the years is we've taken samples for toxins in visible blooms, and then we've collected samples for toxins in like clear water right by them. So this is an example of that at a beach. And so for microcystin, which is the most common toxin we see, the average scum concentration might be something like 179 micrograms per liter, but the average ambient water, and this is from many pairs of scum and ambient samples across different blooms, the average ambient concentration is like 1.6 micrograms per liter. And as far as a recreational guideline for comparison for microcystin, we use the EPA guideline of 8 micrograms per liter. So where many scums exceed that, and you don't want to be contacting the scum, that the ambient is often below that when we're talking about microcystin. And so I just want to note that, you know, Michigan has 11,000 inland lakes, and we have not, you know, received HAB complaints on many of those. And so we want people to have fun in the water. We just want people to become familiar with what cyanobacterial blooms look like and to avoid them and keep themselves and pets out when they see them. For your pets, same thing. The advice that I'll give is, you know, don't rely on natural bodies of water for your pet to drink out of. If you're out there enjoying nature with them, bring along clean, fresh water for them like you would do yourself. We do have resources at michigan.gov/HABs, and that includes some guides and videos on identifying cyanobacterial blooms compared to other algae. And again, I'll share the harmful algal bloom map. It's online at michigan.gov/HABs. This shows verified HAB reports and cyanotoxin testing results. We have different layers that show the most recent 2 weeks and then the entire season. And we update this once a week. Importantly for this map, you know, this is just where blooms were reported to us and the conditions at the time of that report. This isn't meant to be used to indicate where you should and shouldn't swim. And, you know, many blooms may go unreported to us. And so, yeah. And with that, here's my email address if anyone would like to contact me.
Thank you, Alex. That was great. Great overview of the ways that algal toxins can affect us and the pets and livestock that we care for. We have lots of great questions in the Q&A box. For folks who are dropping them in the chat, please also put them in the Q&A box so we can answer some of them in behind the scenes. Several folks are wondering about well water and if well water is at risk of algal toxins, especially if they're located near lakes with blooms. Are there ways to purify water if needed, and what would the testing process look like there?
Sure. So there may be wells, depending on the circumstances of the well, like how deep it is, its age, and its exact proximity to a lake with a bloom. Some of them might be vulnerable, but we don't think that the vast majority of wells are vulnerable. If a lake with a bloom was to flood over the top of the well, that would be a cause for concern. If people do have specific questions about the susceptibility of their wells, they can reach out to MDHHS or their local health department. And if there was a circumstance where we identified a well that we thought was at risk of cyanotoxins, we can test the water.
Great, thank you. Is there good research on how long toxins linger in the water after the visible bloom dissipates?
So for microcystin, which is the most common cyanotoxin that we've found, it's primarily intracellular, so it's within the cells. And that's why we see high concentrations of it in the visible blooms and then not outside of it. And then when those cyanobacteria start dying off, the microcystin and the water degrades very quickly. It's actually, the research shows that there's like bacteria in the water that eat it up. There's more information that suggests cylindrospermopsin does not degrade very quickly. And I'm not familiar with anatoxin A. I'm not familiar with finding that outside of blooms. But we also typically just test, blooms. So.
Thank you for that. A handful of people are wondering about the winter that we've been having, lack of ice cover in the lakes being generally a little bit warmer than they might be. Do we think that a winter like this might predict more or earlier HABs? That might be a question for some of our other presenters as well.
Yes, there's a lot of interactions there. What I'll start off with is with an earlier summer, ice coming off, we might reach stratification earlier. So that is where warm water sits on top of cold water. If it starts earlier, that gives a longer stratified period, this calm, warm water up top. That's good for certain species of cyanobacteria, like Microcystis. Also, as there's a longer period for stratification to take place, there might be more nutrient release in the lower parts of the lake, so that when the lake mixes in the fall, that might release more nutrients for cyanobacteria that do well during mixing periods. So there's a lot of nuance in there, but there's the quick answer.
Great, and maybe one more question specifically for Alex before we move to the final presentation and then the last Q&A section. Several folks are wondering if we have stats, general stats about how many reports of HABs caused human illnesses we see in Michigan, or animal illnesses also.
Yeah, so we do track that, and I don't have that number right in front of me. I can provide that number. I will say that located at michigan.gov/HABs under the reports section, we just got up on there summaries for 2021 and 2022, and those contain the human and animal numbers of human and animal illness reports for 2021 and 2022. As far as numbers, we're really talking about like single digits that have been reported to us.
Although, like you had mentioned, there's the symptoms of a HAB exposure do look a lot like food poisoning or overdoing it in the sun or all sorts of other things that might affect you when you're out on the lake or enjoying a warm day. So the numbers are, I'm sure, a little bit tricky to really know if the full accurate count is there, but glad to know that they're generally low.
And we're going to go to our last speaker. So Eric Elgin is an extension educator with MSU Extension. Eric, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks everybody for sticking with us tonight. And great questions, just like that great question about climate with a lack of ice in like southern Michigan. What will that have an impact? There's so many things that interplay there that it makes it hard to forecast. Also, I saw that there was a observation of increased pH during a cyanobacteria bloom, and that's a great observation. And so pH can be affected by how much photosynthesis can be occurring in a lake at a given time. And so that if there's a lot of photosynthesis, it it removes carbon from the water column. It then changes and removes the hydrogen ion from the water, and then that increases the pH. And that can then change what carbon is available, and then that helps cyanobacteria outcompete other algae. So that seems really complicated, but I'll show you a little bit more about that. So my presentation could go in multiple directions, but we only have a few minutes. And so we decided that we weren't going to talk about some of the short-term management actions that can be taken. For example, if there's some nutrient inactivation products or herbicides, but instead we're going to key in on the prevention of HABs, and what that focuses is on nutrient reduction. Oh yeah, and my name is Eric Elgin. I work with MSU Extension Center for Lakes and Streams, and I work on lake conservation statewide. So as we've now learned, cyanobacteria, broadly speaking, are a part of our lakes, our ponds, our waterways. And as they are an inherent part, they're not invasive, they are part of the system. We are not looking to eliminate them because that is not a practical solution. Instead, what we're looking to do is reduce the frequency and intensity of their blooms. And a lot of that action is looking at nutrient reduction. And when I mention nutrient reduction, I'm particularly focused on the nutrient phosphorus and nitrogen, although there's a other host of nutrients that we're looking at as well. And so I wanted to show just a depiction of kind of summarizing a few of the things that Julianne kind of mentioned and Erica mentioned at the beginning. As cyanobacteria is part of our system, is what we're seeing in this figure is a course of a calendar year from January to December. We typically have ice in Michigan in the winter months, and when that ice, and there's low levels of algae, of a few different kinds of algae. As the ice goes off, certain species take advantage of the conditions that are present. So for example, this big bump here that you see is a diatom bloom, which is a type of algae. They just love cold water. They love having mixing of the water, and there's a good amount of nutrients at this time. As stratification occurs, another species, another group of algae are more competitive. And as you can see, cyanobacteria usually, but not always, we see an abundance of their biomass happening in the later months of the year, although they can occur in other time periods as well. And so now for the rest of the presentation, focused in on nutrient reduction. So I'm going to be giving examples and case studies that we can all do as riparians on the shoreline, but then also looking at it not just as what we can do as individuals, because that is really important, but now to amplify the effect is to also look at the community level and how we all can make a difference at reducing nutrients on our property and at a larger scale. So at the individuals, I'm going to talk about just a small handful of practices. We're going to talk about fertilizer reduction, shoreline gardens, rain gardens, and then aquatic plant protection. So why phosphorus and nitrogen first? So phosphorus is typically the limiting nutrient to growth of algae in lakes. So algae need a whole bunch of nutrients to reproduce, grow, and bloom. And if I put in more manganese, nothing really happens because it's already in good enough abundance. But if I put in more phosphorus, then we see a big explosion of growth, because that's really what's limiting the amount of reproduction that is happening. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's nitrogen is also a key nutrient and is a limiting factor. Then these two nutrients together, how much phosphorus to nitrogen, or how much is there less nitrogen to phosphorus, less phosphorus to nitrogen? That also impacts what type of algae is growing there and how much. And so just like our lakes, then why are we putting phosphorus and nitrogen, a typical fertilizer combination, on our lawns and landscapes? It's because that's also the case in terrestrial systems. So there's a neat study that looked at that the United States Geological Survey did in Wisconsin, looking at the runoff coming off of a lawn surface and a next to a lake and a wooded lot next to a lake. And they looked at the surface water that's running off of it, as well as the shallow groundwater. So some of the water is soaking through, but then flows down a hill into the lake. And what they found was that the phosphorus and nitrogen loading was 10 to 100 times higher on lawns, surface runoff on lawns than on the natural forested shorelines, and 3 to 4 times higher loading of those nutrients just underneath, so the subsurface flow. And so the best practice here is to, one, potentially consider not fertilizing when using phosphorus fertilizer, or not fertilizing at all next to the water's edge. So maybe there's already plenty of phosphorus in the soil, and so you can take a soil test, find out if there is enough, and adding more phosphorus isn't going to do much for your lawn because there's already enough phosphorus in the soil. And also, we would ask, if you're going to add nutrients, add fertilizer, that you would do it in a way that's well calibrated. Don't put on too much, just enough that's recommended with the soil sample. Another way that we can reduce our nutrient inputs on our properties is to look at erosion control. So phosphorus can be bound to sediment, and when our shorelines are eroding, sediment is being released into the water, and phosphorus can be released from that sediment particle and then can be utilized by plant and algae growth. And so if we can stabilize our shorelines, and the best practice for stabilizing our shorelines is using native plants and trees and shrubs, as you can see in this picture, these plants with deep roots and also thick mattress type roots are really holding our soil in place. And so there's not much of erosion at all going into the water. Also, these sort of gardens between our yards and our upland and into our lakes are a buffer. So as water is running off of our, let's say, lawn, as you can see in this circumstance, it is running into a whole bunch of different stems of the grasses and flowers. That slows the water down, allows it to soak into the ground, where plants can uptake those nutrients and hold it in their biomass for the year. They can also change the chemistry of the soil and have nitrogen get lost into the atmosphere through denitrification and other means. Also, I just want to mention that not only is this functional, it's very beautiful. And that's key because when we start talking about putting in shoreline gardens, this is going against kind of the cultural norm that we see on our lakes, and it could be seen as messy by neighbors. And that's tough because we want to fit in naturally into our neighborhoods, but these add a lot of beauty and function. And I just wanted to show a couple of these buffer gardens and how it can look quite natural and just be an extension of your landscaping, where instead of having lawn to the water's edge, we are putting in these nice gardens that have these functional roles as well. Even on steep shorelines, where there might be slumping on your shoreline, these plants can really hold it in place and then again hold the nutrients in place. And if we're afraid, just thinking about, we also live on a lake for a reason. We want to see the lake. We want to enjoy the lake. These gardens do not need to keep us from enjoying. As you can see from this picture, the big picture, they can easily see the lake still. They still have full access with their dock system and even a little beach. And of course, when you add habitat, there's a whole lot of critters that can be there, and that is excellent for adults, but also excellent for kids.
All right, Eric, this is your 5-minute warning.
Thank you. I'll just move on from that. So another practice that I would like to talk about more in the upland part of a yard is our rain gardens. So rain gardens are shallow depressions where runoff is directed towards. So it could be off of your rooftop, it could be off of your lawn, it could be off of your driveway or other hard surfaces. Water moves into it and it gets naturally filtered, and also provides habitat. But for nutrients, it's really great. So phosphorus when the water slows down, phosphorus can either bind with other things like iron, and then they precipitate out. They can bind to soil particles, precipitate out there. And then with normal rain garden maintenance, you can remove that from the system and it doesn't get into our waterways. Nitrogen can be a little bit more tricky, as rain gardens may not be fully designed to remove nitrogen, but there can be ways that you do that, where it promotes the loss of nitrogen into the atmosphere through denitrification. So like I mentioned, location really matters. You can see in these great pictures where a downspout can be brought into that instead of going off on your lawn. This is a nice, beautiful rain garden, nice feature in the yard that is capturing off of a driveway. And then this is capturing maybe a low area where there's a lot of flow. And so these areas, again, are slowing water down, allowing different processes to take place that bind phosphorus and nitrogen, or phosphorus in place, or nitrogen gets either assimilated into plants or removed up into the atmosphere. I wanted to mention protecting aquatic plants. So aquatic plants do a lot. They are in competition for light and nutrients in our systems with algae. And so aquatic plants with their growth can hold the nutrients in place during the growing season. They're holding it in the bodies of the plants. Also, some plants, like think of lily pads, they create shading that occurs. And so it actually is great for the plants, but it outcompetes the algae for light. And this word allelopathy, that is where aquatic plants can release a certain compound into the water or onto its outer area that actually impedes the growth and affects the growth of algae in a negative way. And so certain species have been shown to emit these chemicals that reduce even species of cyanobacteria. And then also aquatic plants change the chemistry of the area, and you can actually get loss of nitrogen into the atmosphere when plants change the oxygen dynamics of an area. And so it's interesting, or what's important to remember too, is that a lot of aquatic plants are also growing in those shallow bays where we might see cyanobacteria grow. And so having a robust aquatic plant community that's diverse and healthy can help improve the conditions with cyanobacteria, especially where they can grow very dense. So at the community scale, we want to scale this up. And the big thing here is commitment and communication. Research has found that if you as an individual commit to a conservation practice, and then you tell a neighbor or tell a friend on that water body, they are more likely to adopt that practice as well. And so now you're amplifying the impact of, say, putting in rain gardens or putting in a shoreline garden. Another great case study that's happening is a lot of lakes have lake associations or lake boards. These organizations can work with their lakeshed neighbors. So in the lakeshed, there could be an urban environment, there could be an agricultural environment that is releasing nutrients into a stream that enters into the lake. The lake board and lake association can work together and reach out to their neighbors in their lakeshed to say, maybe we can provide some financial help to keep nutrients out onto the land and not into the water. And an example of this was a lake in western Michigan worked with a conservation district, and then they also worked with the agricultural neighbor to help pay for a cattle crossing and an exclusion fence to keep the cattle out of a creek that was flowing directly into the lake. The agricultural producer received great fence and a great product, and then the lake received less nutrients into their lake. Also, promoting community-led discussion and action. There are a lot of groups now that we're not that much different. A lot of people want good water quality, some for fishing, some for viewing, some for drinking for livestock. And if we can work together with these groups and then make decisions locally, great things happen. And so I encourage you to take a peek at Fishers and Farmers, which is a great program that is very fruitful, not in Michigan, but I wanted to show it. It's for the upper Mississippi River watershed, but it's such a great program to learn from. You can get involved in local government and really help put in conservation practices at the zoning level. And then also, this is my final point, is to get to know existing programs that already have money and existing infrastructure. There is an amazing amount of wonderful programs within the Farm Bill that work with agricultural lands, wetlands, and forested lands that can do so much. And working with your conservation district, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, Farm Service Agency, MSU Extension, you can get in touch with and learn about these programs to not just maybe implement it yourself, but talk to your neighbors about that. So if you want to learn more about lakes and the dynamics that I was kind of mentioning with that pH swing and climate change and how that affects different things, there's a great class called Introduction to Lakes where you can help learn about those different dynamics. We also have a lot of fact sheets working for gardening and to learn about these different practices, to not only have a beautiful yard, but also to have a functional yard. There's also a great partnership of private, nonprofit, and academic folks that are, it's called the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, trying to improve the conditions of our lake through long-term management and protection of our water bodies. And then finally, the Michigan Inland Lakes Convention is coming up this fall. That's a conference that's happening in Grand Rapids in the beginning of October. And if you want to learn more about lakes, including stuff on cyanobacteria and the long-term management of lakes, please join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. Several folks were wondering, though, if they want to put in buffer zones or rain gardens or work with shoreline plants, who can they go to for advice? And I know that I took a really fantastic rain garden class hosted by local county conservation districts and watershed groups like river keepers and river groups. Are there others that you would point people toward, Eric?
There's a great, for rain gardens, to continue that, Washtenaw County in Michigan has a great master rain gardener program that you can take that you can learn so much. Wisconsin has a wonderful technical manual, so it goes into depth on how to create, how to size the correct, like how big do you make the rain garden. I can get that information and send it along to the team to go out. The Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership is a massive website that has a ton of things for your natural shoreline. What is erosion? What permits do I need? How do I install a bioengineering project? And also there's a certification program that the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership has. And so that list of certified landscapers are people you can tap into, give a call, and get some advice on how to put in a natural shoreline.
Great.
Oh, I will
lots of
mention one more is the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy is a great resource to chat with on your shoreline. They have if you go to any search engine and type in Eagle, EGLE, shoreline protection, they have a wonderful website with a tremendous amount of resources.
Awesome. And there's a comment in the chat. If you are using a septic system and you're near a water body, make sure it's functioning properly. That is a very good piece of advice. Lots of nutrient contamination could possibly be coming from septic systems. So be sure to talk to your county health department if that's something that you're concerned about. Very, very glad for everyone who joined us. We are a little bit over time. Still have lots of good questions in the queue that I don't think we're going to be able to get to tonight. And hopefully we'll be able to post some of those answers, send them out to folks who registered. Erica, any final words you'd like to say?
I just wanted to thank everyone for being here and point out that the resources document that we sent out before this, and we'll also resend after, we'll have a lot of links as well that will answer not all, but at least some of the questions that you posed. So do take a look at that and do follow up if you have more questions with the speakers from tonight. Thanks all for your time and for being here tonight.